Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Antifederalist Radio, providing you with libertarian perspectives and opinions on current events for the liberty-minded. We are taking the fight to the airwaves as we stand for liberty, oppose tyranny, and give equal opportunity in exposing the hypocrisy of the Democrats and the Republicans. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Joe and Joe.
Great to be with you, folks. Joe Sloop, your economic host here. We are going back to our normal schedule of episodes where, both my counterpart, the political activist, as well as myself, will give you the in-depth commentary and insights on the economic and political issues of the day for this week. But then next week, it is our pleasure to announce that we will be interviewing Spike Cohen, who is the VP for the Libertarian National candidacy, supporting Joe Jorgensen for president. But tonight, I, your economic host, will be covering the updates on the COVID recession as well as an inflation update. And we're getting just a little bit of background noise going on. Can we get that resolved right quick?
I think it's you, Paul. Looks like we're good.
Okay. There we go. Now we're all clear. So, that was my update. So, Joe, what do you have covering for tonight?
So the city of Asheville, North Carolina, just approved a resolution saying they are going to give reparations to the black community for segregation and slavery and the systematic racism since then. And I will be discussing less on that, but mostly on the ideas of reparations in general.
Okay, and I look forward to hearing that. Did you, before we start, happen to do any kind of research of what does that mean? What policies are they approaching there in Asheville that is under that umbrella of quote-unquote reparations?
I have read the resolution.
Cool, because I would be interested in hearing that tonight, and I'm sure our folks at home who are listening to us would as well. Look, guys, if you want to be part of this show, if you have questions that or topic ideas that you want us to discuss, you can like and follow us on Facebook. You can email us at antifederalistradio@gmail.com. If you just want to listen in, you can find us on Blog Talk Radio. You can find us on Stitcher, Spotify, even YouTube now, and Google Podcasts, and so much more. And if you want to call into our show, you can reach us at 516-418-5584. That's 516-418-5584. That'll put you in the host queue where our control board person, Paul, will go over and vet you to bring you on air. So anyway, without further ado, I will start off. So it has been a while since I've given you an economic update, but I might as well figure that this will be as good a time as any. With COVID cases increasing in the United States, and they are increasing, where the daily rates as provided by the World Health Organization have reached confirmed cases of over 70,000 per day for the last several days. Now, yesterday they did drop a little bit, and hopefully that will mean that we're finally peaking and going on a downward trend, but somehow I doubt that. With the economy, our nation's economy, mostly reopened, but still some places closed, I thought it prudent to give you guys an update on what that means for our future in the markets. And what does this recession mean now? So that being said, let me preface all of this that this is an extremely unique situation that we have going on. Never in our country's history have we had a forced government shutdown of this nation's economy. And as such, calculating and estimating the damage that is done from this is extremely difficult. It's because there's really no basis to match this against previously. And quite frankly, this can go one of three ways. Way number one is the way most most people would want it to go, where, okay, business is shut down, but now that the economy is reopening, the economy comes roaring back to life, and life as we know it begins to return back to normal, or at least some sort of normalcy where people can go back to work and your job is still there waiting for you when the economy opens back up. And, of course, the government provides generous unemployment benefits and subsidies to you while you're gone to help alleviate your painful woes, as you are not able to go to work because the government deemed that it was too unsafe for you to do it. Scenario number 2 is where is the next best scenario, where, the economy takes a hit. We go into recession, which is exactly what we've done now, and we might not get all that strong of a bounce back, but over time, life will get back to normal. We're still able to buy the things that we need to buy. We're still able to get food and essentials. People might be, going delinquent on their loans, but emergency loans provided by the government, as well as policies set by your local banks, allow you to stretch out those loan payments or perhaps delay those loan payments because of the, extraordinary circumstances. And then we go into scenario 3. And scenario 3 is obviously what the doom and gloomers, myself included, have been worried about, is that this leads to a total breakdown of the economy. Now, we in the good old USA have never seen this happen, particularly in the young generation, such as myself. I am only 34 years old. We have never, other than the 2008 financial crisis, been through a situation where we would have to worry about not only what kind of job and means of income that we would be able to provide ourselves, but actually to a point where certain goods might become rare and difficult to find. And it's hard and it can be painful to go through that. And I'm not just talking about toilet paper and Clorox and certain cleaning items. I'm talking about necessities that can potentially happen, such as long lines at gas stations because of gas shortages, which is what we had in the 70s. Or in this case, most likely what we could be seeing is a disruption in the supplies for food production. So with all that being said, I'm going to give you an update on our economy of where I think that we stand to give you an idea of where I think that we are headed. And then I'm going to give you a couple of opposing views or differing views. I wouldn't say that they are opposing, but they are differing views. But these are not by your mainstream economists. Mainstream economists, they're dominated predominantly by the Keynesian economics that both the liberal Democrats and the conservative Republicans hold to, have failed. They are utter failures in the way that they even look at our markets. They have no concept of reality of the way that the world works. The concepts that I'm going to give to you, including my own, are from the Austrian Business School theory, which is libertarian economic theory, and that is the most accurate. There's no doubt. This is just me being an economist telling you that is the most accurate portrayal of the way our market systems work and the way that our world works today and how we interact between each other when we do such things as trading, buying, selling, and going to work and producing. So with that, there's no doubt that with the government shutdowns that the economy has taken a hit. I mean, that's a no-brainer. It's really what's concerning has been the government response to that. And the response has been, widely varied. Essentially, they have let loose all barrels to combat any kind of damage that their government shutdown has done by basically trying to hit everybody with a gigantic anesthetic. And that is to basically give everybody a gigantic pain pill in the form of monetary stimulus. So if you lost your job, then you're getting unemployment. That's subsidies from the government. You are getting you've got your $1,200 stimulus bill. That's another subsidy from the government. And then on top of that, your government is now debating right now inside Congress another stimulus bill to come down the pipeline. Then on top of that, they have basically subsidized businesses who have been shut down by their state and have basically provided subsidies to loans and loans to businesses in order to keep them alive during this shutdown. And all of that has a gigantic consequence. The ultimate consequence of it all, not to mention, I won't go into the particulars, but to give you the Cliff Notes version, is that money has a cost. It's not just created out of thin air and there is no damage done. No, there was damage done, and there was damage done now. It hurt the investment sector of the economy. It hurt the ability for businesses to borrow and invest in productive sectors of the economy that were allowed to stay open. So what was open was taking the hit and paying for what was closed. Now, some people might think that that's equitable because, well, it's not fair that some sectors were allowed to remain open and other sectors were to remain closed. But that's the problem, don't you see? The government should never have really closed down the economy at all. I don't care what the reason is. Everybody's got to go to work. And if you don't work, you don't eat. And that's the point, is that the sectors that were allowed to remain open did take the hit from this. Resources were taken away from them to be distributed to the sectors that were not productive. And instead of allowing the economy to naturally adjust to that, instead, what we are getting is a whole different disruption. And that disruption is basically the government trying to bridge the existing economy together with debt. It's trying to push the markets up with debt. And all of that is going to come to fruition with the ultimate consequence that Austrian economists have been predicting for the last decade in the form of rising price inflation. Now, essentially, as I have stated before, with why we have not had inflation, this was months ago. So if you can review and listen to our previous podcast, I talked about and mentioned why we have not exactly gotten hit by bad price inflation yet. And that basically has to do with the fact that overseas there is a demand for our currency, for our dollar. Now, I'm not going to go into those details again, but let me expand upon that, though. Basically, what it means is that we are able to borrow from the world's wealth in order to satisfy ourselves. And that has been the only reason why our currency has not collapsed yet. We are consuming what the world has produced. The United States is not a net producer to the world's goods. We import goods more than we export. And what that means is that essentially we consume more than we produce on an aggregate scale. Okay? We consume so much that we have to ship jobs overseas and have them ship goods to us in order to fuel our demands. And all of that has been caused by unprecedented monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, the whole nine yards. And the only reason why that has not collapsed yet is that other countries will print their own currencies to buy ours, so that way they can continue exporting goods for us. But in so doing, we have translated and transitioned our inflation to those countries, and they are the ones that will suffer from that, while we get off scot-free and are able to live off the world's wealth. And as long as we are able to live off the world's wealth, then, this cycle can continue, but it can only continue for so long.
And I just want to add to that, for any Trump fans listening who are hearing about how we are living off the world's wealth and we are not net exporters of anything, and you're getting all excited because Trump is right and Trump's doing his tariff thing, and tariffs are going to save us and they're going to make us a net exporter and they're going to close the trade deficit. I just want you to know, it's very easy to Google and verify. Our trade deficit, specifically with China, has increased almost as much under Trump in 4 years as it did under Obama in 8 years. Despite our tariffs, our trade deficit with China has been skyrocketing under Trump. The tariffs are not working. The economic nationalism is not accomplishing anything. Maybe we should just give up on it and go back to a free market. Back to you, Joe.
Excellent point, Joe. And let me build off of that one for a second. So our trade deficit started in 1980. And what I believe, and most Austrian economists tend to agree with this, is that we believe that the basic thing that caused us to derail and start being a net consumer of wealth of the world is that we came off the gold standard. So by us basically recklessly printing money, the world has been mistakenly believing that our dollars are still valuable because there is this global disconnect, direct disconnect between U.S. dollars and gold. It has allowed for misvaluations of the U.S. dollar to occur. So let me give you an example here, guys. Have you ever wondered why our stock market started to go into wild swings since the mid-1990s? Well, if you listen to Republican economics will go all day long and say that the reason why the stock market grew was because people valued the stock market that way. That was what they valued the stocks at, and that's why the prices went up. They're right on that mark, but here's where they're wrong. They believe in this fictitious notion that markets are always efficient. So if the stock price were to jump up by 50%, they would believe that that is a legitimate growth in value in those stocks. This is why in the mid-2000s, they did not see the housing bubble. When the housing prices started to climb, being fueled by debt, they just jumped up and down and said, oh, well, real wealth is going up, and so there's nothing wrong with it. They never looked to peek beneath the surface and think that maybe housing prices were being overvalued. To them, that was not possible. And that's why they refused to recant their message, their dogma, admit that their philosophy was wrong, and realize that markets can be overvalued or undervalued. Well, right now, what I'm telling you is that the U.S. dollar is overvalued. It is overvalued. It's in a bubble in itself. And when that ultimate bubble collapses, which we will have done to ourselves, it will destroy all of our wealth here at home because it will cause rising prices to escalate. And indeed, right now, Austrian economists are beginning to sound the alarm that this may be what we are seeing now. In a recent article published on Mies.org, which is basically the libertarian economics hubbub home for all economic sources, there is an article right there that has been titled Inflation, This Time is Different, by Alistair MacLeod. And this Alistair makes this point here. He said this, and I quote, following Lehman's failure, a similar pattern to the one unfolding today of a rapid increase in bank assets through the newly invented QE, quantitative easing, was followed by a contraction of bank credit which lasted about 15 months. But that crisis was about financial assets in the mortgage markets, which then had knock-on effects in the non-financials. Difficult though it was, its resolution was relatively predictable. However, this crisis started in the non-financials and is therefore more damaging to the economy. Its severity is likely to lead to a banking crisis far larger than the Lehman failure and possibly greater than anything seen since the 1930s depression. So what Alistair is pointing out is that the source of this crash, government as it is actually in the production of real goods and services. And because its source is there, it will have distortive effects in the financial sectors because when you have less supplies of goods available, the price of those goods go up eventually. Now, since the crash, though, prices here for consumer goods have not gone up. They've been going down or staying flat, mostly because the sectors that were shut down couldn't sell any goods at all. In the meantime, and this is actually a good thing, personal savings skyrocketed. So despite all the fiscal stimulus by our federal government and the monetary stimulus by the Federal Reserve, back in Q1 2020, our net savings rate in the United States was actually positive. And it was because in April and May of 2020, Your savings rate for personal savings increased from, say, 6 to 10% up to over 30% as people started stockpiling cash into savings accounts and trying to save that away, which was exactly what you needed to do. If you're in a crash and you're running short of money, common sense finance is exactly what you need to follow. And that's exactly what we did. But you see now that cash is coming back out into the market. As the economy has reopened, people are starting to spend that wealth, and now it is starting to drive up consumer prices. So in the last month's consumer price report, we had consumer prices, and I'm giving you the unadjusted numbers, not the seasonally adjusted. We had consumer prices increase across the board by 0.5%. That 0.5% may not seem like much, but that's on a monthly basis. If we were to annualize that, that's a 6% inflation rate. Let me tell you something. We have not had a 6% inflation rate in the United States in 30 years. And this is the case. Back in the 80s, when we had those higher inflation rates, we had a debt-to-GDP ratio of about 200%. That's all debt. Total debt in our entire economy was about 200% of what we would grossly produce. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at 400% of debt to GDP. We have twice as much debt as we have now, which means any kind of inflation rate will have twice as much damage on the economic front, because if people get to the point where goods are going up so high that they cannot pay for their loans and all the money that they borrowed, they're going to go bankrupt. If they go bankrupt and businesses go bankrupt, there's going to be massive losses, huge unemployment, which has led certain libertarian economists to predict, myself included, that we're not going to go into a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery, but we're actually going to go into a W-shaped recovery, which is basically defined, and this is defined in another Mies article by Andrew Moran, as a W-shaped is a steep decline, followed by a sharp rise, followed by another significant drop, then ending with a spike, also known as a double-dip recession. And it is very likely that even if we emerge from this crisis, the damage that we have incurred to our economy is permanently damaged, and it could cause significant feedbacks in debt defaults. Now, those are what Austrian economists are looking at right now. My own assessment of this is a little bit different, and that is I'm using my own economic model that I've created and that I've looked at based off of debt. And what I think is happening right now is that debt right now, despite how high it is, because our Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates all the way to zero, basically 0 to 0.25%. They've lowered the Fed funds rate. It has the interest rates low enough on the loans and the debt to basically float our economy for some time. But if the consumer prices start going up and they stay above the interest rates, especially what I would say is the bank prime loan interest rate, which is right now at about 3 to 3.25%. It's always the Fed funds rate plus 3%. Then we could see interest rates start to be forced up. And this would be a situation where our Federal Reserve would have lost all control over interest rates, which has never happened before in history. If they lose all control and interest rates go up, that means the price, the cost of a mortgage goes up, the cost of a car loan goes up, the cost of personal loans go up, your credit card loans, everything goes up. Now, if you own a car and it's a secured fixed interest rate loan, and if you're on a mortgage and it's a fixed interest rate loan, you don't have much to worry about. But for the borrowers that are wanting to purchase a home in the future, they will have to worry about that. Now, the last time that we had a situation when inflation rate was higher than the interest rates were, that was back, I had to go all the way back to the 1950s with it, and they stayed elevated for about a year. So the average inflation rate at that time was about 5 to 6%, and the bank prime loan rate at that time was about 2%. During that year, the bank prime loan rate did not get forced up, for reasons why, other than the fact that the Fed was trying to keep the rates down with the Fed funds rate. At least on the short end, Short-term interest rates were not forced up right away from inflation. They did start edging up toward the end of the year, so it went from 2 to 2.5%, but that was also because the Fed had raised rates by about 0.5%. So I don't really think that the inflation had the effect on it. But theory holds that eventually those high prices will force those interest rates up. If they don't, they'll lead to losses in the banks anyway, because the banks are basically losing money on every loan that they create. So it would curtail loaning out money, which would then cause the crash anyway. But either way that you look at it, I would say that if we start seeing inflation rates higher than 3% on an annualized basis for over a year, then we are in significant trouble economically. And this is the reason why that my counterpart and I are libertarians. Republicans and Democrats are not going to address this. Donald Trump is not going to address this. Let me be clear here. Donald Trump has come out publicly and said that he's a low interest rate guy. Low interest rates is what has created our gigantic debt bubble today. Donald Trump is not solving the problem. Donald Trump is adding to the problem. He is causing the problem. Look at the government deficit. They are higher now than they've ever been before, and I'm talking about before COVID-19. They're higher now than they ever were under Obama, and Obama had to deal with the recession. Trump, before COVID-19, didn't even deal with the recession. We're still running out of those deficits. Look at the trade deficit. It's worse now than it ever was before. And for all the people who sit there and brag about the stock market, well, yeah, that works if you're uber wealthy, but for the average Joe Schmuckatelli who lives on Main Street, they don't really have much invested in Wall Street and such. And so they're not really benefiting from all of that bubble price that has been pushed up by debt. And the only thing that Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever replaces Joe Biden as president after it gets revealed that he has dementia, all they're going to do is push for more lower interest rates, more money printing, and that's going to press prices up. The only way that we're going to press prices down is to actually cut government spending, to actually reduce the size of government, to do the things that the Republican Party says that they'll do, but they never do once they're elected into office. And that, my friends, can only come from Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen. So, this November, for the sake of our economy, for the sake of our livelihoods, you're going to have to vote gold. If you're a Republican listening on this, there ain't no option for you. Trump is not going to save you. Trump is going to crush you. And you are a fool if you think otherwise. If you're going to vote for Joe Biden, do I even have to tell you that Joe Biden is a moron? Do I really have to spell that out? Even if you admit that he's not a moron, he's so feeble-minded, he is not going to have sense enough for this. We have got to vote in sensible people who realize just simple things, and that is our government spends too much money, and we're involved in too many wars overseas, and we want to bring them home, the troops home, and let them be reunited with their families and give you a little bit more personal liberty. So that's why the Libertarian Party needs your help, because they're there fighting for you. So right now, if you're listening to this show, show some support for the Libertarian Party. You can sign up and become a registered libertarian. You can contact them and volunteer. You can go to lp.org on the national scale. Go to LPNC if you're in North Carolina, which is where we're based, and see if you can advertise. They can always use your donations. Donate to Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen. Anything that you can to help will go the longest way into supporting this. But right now I can tell you that the way that the two-party system has taken us economically is the exact same destination, and that's over a cliff. This inflation crisis is going to build out of nowhere. And while the right-wing Republican conservatives that have turned into neo-fascists are sitting there and wasting our money on military warfare over and over again in fruitless wars that don't make us any safer, while we're paying for other countries' defense, the left then goes to tell us to say that we need to become more like Europe, that we need to redistribute more of our wealth like the socialists in Europe. Never mind the fact that we are subsidizing their defense. If they had our defense budgets, their budgets would crumble. But the reason why we're subsidizing their defense is because your right-wing neocon Republicans are not willing to use some common sense and say, maybe we should close down some of those hundreds of bases that we have overseas and bring our boys home. No, sir, it's all about the military-industrial complex with them. So they're not going to do anything about it. And the Democrats, in the meantime, are sitting there finding new schemes and new ways to redistribute our wealth. And one of the age-old ways that they're trying this is with reparations. So reparations comes back to you with the concept that after post-World War II, with what happened with the enslavements of African-American communities and the African-American peoples as an ethnic race, there was an idea that after slavery was abolished and the African Americans were set free legally, that there should be reparations paid to those citizens for incurring the damages of being enslaved under their white owners. Ladies, I'm just going to lay this out to you. We're debating this 150 years after slavery ended. Nobody alive today enslaved anyone. Nobody alive today was enslaved by anyone. And while we can debate the merits about, going back and tracing the family lineage and saying, well, because 150 years ago my ancestors were enslaved, so-and-so owes me money, the only thing that they're willing to do, that the Democrats are willing to do, is just steal more wealth from the productive to give to the unproductive. Joe, you got anything to add on that part before we go over to your bit?
Nope, up to you.
Okay. Cool. So,
all right.
Yep, it's over to you now. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent there with my spill over there. But Joe will be covering the reparations topic for you.
All right. So, on the subject of reparations, Asheville, North Carolina, just signed a resolution unanimously 7-0 of their city council. And what it says is, it is titled the Resolution Supporting Community Reparations for Black Asheville. Whereas black people have been unjustly enslaved, and whereas black people have been unjustly segregated, and whereas black people have been unjustly incarcerated, and there's about 9 more of those, we go on to say the City Council of the City of Asheville, 1, apologizes and makes amends for its participation in and sanctioning of the enslavement of black people. 2, apologizes and makes amends for its enforcement of segregation and its accompanying discriminatory practices. 3, apologizes and makes amends for carrying out an urban renewal program that destroyed multiple successful black communities. 4, calls on other organizations and institutions in Asheville that have advanced and benefited from racial inequality to join the city in its apologies and invites them to address racism within their own structures and programs and to work with the city to more comprehensively address systematic racism. 5, calls on the state of North Carolina and the federal government to initiate policy making and provide funding for reparations at the state and national levels. 6, directs the city manager to establish a process within the next year to develop short, medium, and long-term recommendations to specifically address the creation of generational wealth and to boost economic mobility and opportunity in the black community. 7, fully supports its equity department staff and its work and encourages the city manager to utilize their talents when forming policy and programs that will establish the creation of generational wealth and address reparations due in the black community as mentioned above. 8, seeks to establish within the next year a new commission empowered to make short, medium, and long-term recommendations that will make significant progress towards repairing the damage caused by public and private systematic racism. Other local government community organizations may also be invited to, okay, that's kind of the drowning out of it. Calls on the city manager to give at minimum a biannual update to the city council on the progress of work performed pursuant to this resolution. Read, approved, and adopted this 14th day of July. So, spoiler, if you're here to hear me say at the end of this session, yes, we should absolutely do it, or no, we absolutely should not do it, or a very specific plan laid out on how to do it, I'm going to tell you right now, the only clear conclusion I'm going to give you at the end of this session is that it is just incredibly fucking complicated. But we'll dive right into it. I will be drawing my conclusions from a foundation of Lockean philosophy. So if you find John Locke's philosophy to be inherently flawed, you're going to find fault in literally everything I'm about to say. But we're going to dive in. So first, I'm going to talk about what John Locke said about slavery. And in his book, Two Treatises of Civil Government, he describes the scenarios in which slavery is justified. And what he describes is essentially, if someone tries to kill you, they didn't try to take your death. It's not your death they tried to seize from you, it's your life they tried to seize from you. Therefore, in very simple, just terms, equal restitution for the crime committed against you is not death. You're not owed their death, you're owed their life. And when you have that life, you have the choice of destroying it because you are legally justified as they tried to destroy you, or in this moment, when it's within your power to legally and justly kill them, if you want to give them an order and they want to follow it so as to stay alive, congratulations, you have landed in just slavery. At any given moment, it is within your power legally to kill them. You're electing not to. It's within their power to refuse that order. It's just going to mean they die. And this is just because they are a murderer or attempted murder or some other heinous crime that has earned them this justified death penalty. Now, as this applies to the Atlantic slave trade, from the studying I was doing, I'm not even going to throw that word. I read the Wikipedia page. Most slaves imported across the Atlantic were not seized by Europeans, but so far as I can interpret, it still wasn't just slavery. It wasn't the case of these coastal communities had withstood horrible onslaughts and attacks from aggressive raiders, and now the raiders are in bondage. Usually it's the other way around. You get raided and you get taken into bondage. The slave history in Africa is very complicated, so it's really hard to say, but for the most part we can assume most of the slaves were not seized in a justifiable means. Now, we add 1 degree of separation to that when you're buying the slave. If you didn't yourself seize them, are you complicit in the crime of unjust slavery? I'm inclined to think yes, especially if you're not ignorant to it. If you know what's going on, I'm inclined to say yes. If you want to break lines with me there, that's fine. But one thing that's very and absolutely clear is that even if you are justly a slave, that stops with you. That's punishment for your crimes. Now, when you are brought over and you have children, and those children are born into bondage, there's no version of that that is justifiable slavery. So, to describe the situation of reparations, if you are in unjust bondage and you are working, labor produces property. And Locke describes that as, if nature was given to man by God and given to man in common by God, nature is all of ours. That rabbit belongs to all of humanity, but it becomes your rabbit when you hunt it, chase it, kill it, skin it, and cook it. You put that labor in, and now everyone generally understands it's your rabbit. To apply that to labor, the fruits of your labor are your property. Your toils and the things you produce from your toils are your property. And this is how an economy works. This is how the world works. If I go in and work, I mean, I'm working for my employer. He's getting the literal physical product that I produce, but we have an agreement that he is paying me a wage, and I have agreed to that wage. I have agreed that the fruits of my labor are generally worth this particular wage per hour. This is understood. So the easiest way to measure what would need to be reparated is to take, a census of all unjust slaves that we had. The easiest ones to point out are the ones that were born into bondage. Take 400 years of lifetimes of stolen labor and the property that was produced thereunto of. And that's your stolen labor. Well, what's that got to do with reparations? Well, hear me out. Imagine you have two people. Yeah, Joe, what's up? Joe, you there?
Hey, I was just going to say right there what you touched on about the property. That was a good point, that you're saying that that you agree to be paid a wage when you are employed. And I know where you're going with that, but I wanted to point out that a couple of things. One is that when you're getting paid a wage, that is a transference of property if you're thinking about monetarily, because you're getting paid by the revenues of that business, which comes out of the assets of that business. So they are transforming a certain property. The difference is that the property is something that both you and the owner have agreed to trade to you for your work. And then the second part is the reason why you don't get as bigger of a piece of it is because that owner has done everything to set up your work job. In other words, they have given you any kind of training that you need. They have provided you all the tools and machinery and equipment. They have gotten staff to oversee you. They usually provide for you in terms of safety gear if you're working a trade or something. The only thing that you have to do is show up and do your job. The rest of the legwork has been done by them. So I just wanted to point that one out.
As Marx would put it, they control the means of production. They control the capital. To simplify it, you and your employer agreed on what you were worth. I mean, you decided what your labor was worth. That's when you took the job. You said, yeah, I'll work for that. You're right. Lord, did I get derailed? No, I didn't. I know where I'm at. So to apply that whole philosophy on slavery and unjust slavery, which is stolen labor, stolen property, and what that means to reparations, hear me out. And I'm going to make this very simple, and it's going to quickly become complicated. If you steal my property, and we're going to discuss this in terms of property. It was labor, but it's property. I think I made that point. If you steal my property, let's say you steal 100 units of my property, you owe me that back. You owe me that amount back. It's an eye for an eye. You've seized my property. You owe it to me back. Now, if you turn around while you're not returning my property to me, and you invest some of that and you make some money back, and you stole 100 units from me, you make 110, you don't owe me the profit on your investment. You owe me my fucking property. Give me my 100 back. In the same sense, if you turned around and you invested my 100 units and you squandered it and you lost it all, you're not washed away. You owe me my 100 back. So this is where the concept of reparations starts, is that property, labor was stolen, i.e. property, and it's owed back. And you can get in there and quantify how much. I can't do it, but if you divide, 400 years worth of lifetimes of stolen labor. Now, where this starts to get complicated, you stole 100 units from me. You and I both died. My children are supposed to be the heirs of my estate. Now, part of that estate was stolen by you. And presumably, your children inherited your estate. Now, if your children inherit this 100 units of stolen property, it's still stolen property. It's not theirs. and it needs to go back to the righteous owner, which is the heir to the person whose property was stolen. And we've now got 1 degree of separation, and shit is going to immediately get complicated. Because with the original generation, you had guilt and stolen property. If I had squandered that property, I still owe it to you. Now we go to the next generation, and maybe I build a fortune on your 100 units while you're living in poverty because you did not inherit your father's estate. I owe you what was stolen, but I don't owe you my fortune. I owe you what was stolen. It's an eye for an eye, not an eye for an eye plus interest. I didn't commit any crime. I didn't wrong you. I didn't own a slave, and I didn't steal the labor or the property. But I did inherit the stolen property, and I owe it to you. Now let's remove one more generation. Let's go one more generation and complicate it a little bit more. You know, I didn't invest your stolen property and make a fortune off of it. I invested your stolen property and squandered it. I fucked up. And this is where you encounter it with a lot of white people, and I've said it myself. It's like, well, you know, where's my white privilege? I'm fucking broke. My dad didn't leave me anything. Well, here's where we are immediately running into some concerns with reparations, is that we're 2 generations down. You are still owed that stolen property, but you've got to get it from the estate. Now, if I die and I had debt, my debtors get to lay claim on my estate before my heirs. Your debtors get to rip an estate to pieces if you owe money, and then whatever's left after they take what's owed to them is what passes on to your children. And if you owed more than you had, the debtors take everything, and you leave your children nothing. So if my dad's estate was squandered, if he squandered his fortune and squandered that stolen property and left me nothing, I am no longer the heir to stolen property, and I am not the guilty party who stole the property. So you can't come after me for anything. And this is why this gets messy, because, you know, 150 years later, we can readily identify the rightful heirs to the stolen property. It is quite simple. If you can trace your lineage to a slave, chances are you are the rightful heir to stolen property. On the other side of the fence, identifying the heirs or the current holders of said stolen property gets a lot more complicated. So there's the simplest way to put it is that, yes, those people who are heirs to property that was stolen from their ancestors are owed that property back. They are owed the estates they were supposed to inherit. We have found and determined the victim party. But with every new degree of separation, it gets more difficult to dial in on where the stolen property is gone, which is why reparations tends to look like this. This is where the conversation goes, where Asheville went. And what they're wanting to do is things like invest in, you know, affordable housing and put money back in the community. So instead of pursuing the stolen property, what we are going to do is we are going to tax the entire community, including the heirs of the rightful heirs of the stolen property. You're going to get taxed to finance your own reparations, and then we're going to invest it into your community. Now let's talk about why that's going to turn into a fucked up mess. Well, quite simply because... Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Paul, would you mind playing the soundbite? While we're getting here, we're getting to this point, I'm going to put the nail in the coffin on this. This is Martin Luther King.
At the same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest. which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
It disappeared.
Wait a minute. It
Thank
didn't
you, Paul.
disappear. You might forget Martin Luther King was
that?
assassinated in April. The Poor People's Campaign.
Hopefully. Thank you. So that was Martin Luther King on reparations, and everything he just said checks out. What he was referring to, at the same time that they refused to give the Negro any land, what he is referring to is, what was it called, Order 15, I believe, Special Field Orders number 15, Series 1865. General William Tecumseh Sherman, where is it? Provided for the confiscation of 400,000 acres of land along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and then dividing it up into parcels of not more than 40 acres, of which were to be settled by approximately 18,000 formerly enslaved families and other black people then living in the area. There was also supposed to be mules loaned or given to help till the land. This order was reversed almost as soon as Abraham Lincoln turned cold. He was assassinated. President, I believe it was Andrew Johnson was who came in. But yes, President Andrew Johnson immediately, as soon as he took the White House, said, no such land reparations. We're not doing anything like that. So at the same time that we were not giving out that land, in 1862, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act basically provided that roughly 2.5 million, I think this is either 2.5 million or 250 million, I forget the number, and I know that's a whole lot to be off by. Basically everything west of the Appalachian Mountains was fair game. If you could get yourself out there, you could have a chunk of that land to farm. And I've read the Homestead Act. It literally makes no mention of Native Americans. It makes no mention of the word Indian or First Nations, anything of the sort. Basically, all the people already living there, fuck them, clear them like trees. And that's what Martin Luther King is referring to, that literally in the 1860s, as we were giving out land to literally whoever wanted to go out past the Appalachians and get it, we were denying that to African Americans. Glad we got that in there. Back on subject, talking about what Asheville's about to do and why they're going to fuck this up. They're talking about reinvesting in the community. They even mention for carrying out an urban renewal program that destroyed multiple successful black communities. For those that don't know, urban renewal is basically like, hey, we've got this rundown neighborhood. We're going to turn it into a blossoming, vibrant retail area or, nicer housing area. We're going to talk about how they're going to screw this up along the way. Let's discuss their options. One of the things that I remember seeing in an interview about this was that they talked about housing. They talked about black ownership of housing. Let's think about how you do that. Option number one, you take steps to ensure that they can get loans. And we've already seen why that's a bad idea. Look, banks already play ridiculously fast and loose with their loans. We've already talked about fractional reserve banking on this show. Despite their assumption that nothing will ever go wrong, banks are still working off of algorithms and still working within the bounds of what they consider acceptable risk. And if they're not making loans to people with X number of capital, X number of income, and X number of credit, it's because that will inevitably, when you apply it to enough people, result in so many defaults, there's the word, and now you're in a housing crisis. So what are the other options we have? Well, we can subsidize the housing. If you subsidize the housing, every homeowner in America that's trying to sell is just going to raise the price. We've seen it with what happens with financial aid in college. It's what will happen with housing. If you just give the consumer more money, the price point goes up. So giving out loans is not going to work. That's going to backfire. We saw that backfire with the housing bubble. Subsidizing is already going to fuck up. That's not going to work. And these are the kinds of options we have. I guess you could do what South Africa did and just seize the land, and that didn't work. That went terribly. There is no good and socialist way to help the little guy get ahead. It inevitably helps the people that already have the money. A lot of people don't know this. Donald Trump's father built his fortune building government-subsidized housing. That is how we got Donald Trump. Socialism helps the rich. Democratic socialism helps the rich. And that is what Asheville's already wanting to do. Now, let's discuss the libertarian option. And I'm going to apply it to, say, not housing specifically, but one of my favorite examples is weed, the legalization of weed, and why the libertarians break off from progressives. On social issues, libertarians and progressives are quite nearly harmonious. We disagree on the economics of it, which is the means to achieve our social goals. And it looks like we've got a caller. Yeah, Paul, you can bring him on. And he is a past caller. Naz. Hello, Naz?
Yeah, it's Naj. What's going on, man?
Naz, welcome aboard. Oh, yes, we did have you on.
Yeah.
What can I do for you?
Down here in Atlanta. Oh, just wanted to join in on the conversation, man. It seems like a interesting show you got here. When I looked at the topic, that's why I called in.
I hope you caught me at the beginning.
No, just the last few, maybe 5 minutes, something like that.
All right. Well, is there any question I can answer?
Yeah, you were just talking about the one I think you said Asheville?
Asheville, North Carolina.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to really look at this yet, but I don't know. I think it's kind of foolhardy to jump into a policy that has to be a national policy and trying to do it locally. I don't think you have enough funds to actually do it. I don't think you have the manpower to do it. And it may end up being used later on as a reason why other things can't get done. But, reparations is a very important thing, man. And
it is.
I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but it'll probably be some of the most important American legislation that we ever get if we do get it done. It's going to fix a lot of things in two communities. It's going to fix a lot of things that have happened to black people in America based on just, material loss and some of the things you talked about where you brought up King and him bringing up the Homestead Act and things like that. It's going to address that. And then in the other community, meaning the white community, then you're talking about coming to a certain realization that harm has been done. You fix the harm, and you also fix yourself, because then talking about what? A clean slate. You're talking about a new relationship between the communities. And, hey, man, I always feel better after I pay somebody something I owe them, And I think that'll happen as far as relations here, man. I think this could be a significant thing, somewhere up close to the Marshall Plan, as far as scale and as far as effectiveness, because this could really be a boom for the whole country.
It really could be, as long as it's done well. And there's a million different ways to squander it. And I don't know. You came in about when we were playing the King soundbite. It looks like I think you missed me describing the justification for reparations from a Lockean perspective. And I don't know how you feel about John Locke. If you find fault in Lockean perspective and Lockean philosophy, you're going to find fault in a lot of this. But the short version of what I was saying is that we can readily identify the wronged party. And this is specifically referring to slavery, not segregation, not systematic racism. We can readily identify the wronged party. And when it comes to the wrongs of slavery, the easiest way to measure it with reparations is that it was labor that was stolen, and labor is the means to acquire property, so it was property that was stolen. You toiled, but you got nothing for your toil. Now, where things get complicated is that I can inherit that stolen property, and I still owe it to return stolen property to its rightful heir. But I don't inherit the sin. And you get a few generations removed, and it gets complicated because this person over here inherited stolen property and built a fortune on it, and they still owe at least the inherited stolen property. But this person over here inherited stolen property, and they squandered it and died penniless and left nothing to their kids. And their kids did not inherit stolen property, but over here they did. So it gets messy because we have a readily identifiable victim party, but there's no clean and easy way to dial in on, and again, specifically referring to slavery, there's no easy way to dial in on exactly who inherited the stolen labor and the benefits of the stolen property, which is why what we end up doing is taxing the entire community, including the victim party, and then just trying to invest that tax money into the victim's community. And then if you fuck that up, I'm actually glad you got me here. If we dial in on exactly how much is owed, and that's a philosophical thing because realistically we can't, but if we came to a dollar amount that everyone agreed upon, and let's say for the city of Asheville, referring strictly to their own sins, we came to the tune of, I don't know, freaking $500 million or $5 billion, whatever it is. And they set aside that $5 billion to put it directly into the black community. If they fuck that up, if they're operating on flawed economic principles, is the bill paid? And I'm asking you, I want to hear your thoughts on it. Is the bill paid when it's been paid, but misapplied?
Hold tight. Let's get back to the beginning. I think there's a couple wrong turns made, and I think that's why you came to the conclusion you did. First things first, you're not going after private families. This is not something where private families would be asked to pay the bill on this. You're talking about governments. Private families were what? Normal people acting within the realm of the laws that existed at the time. So who are you actually talking about? Targeting the government, the ones who created the laws and put the system in place for those people to benefit from it. So you're not going after regular folks or taxpayers or anything like that. That's not even a part of it. I would suggest you look up a guy, Sandy Darity. He's the head of econ at Duke University. Just put out a book a couple of months ago, From Here to Equality, where he not only lays out the plan, how it should be paid, who's responsible, and how long it should be done for. You can kind of really get an idea of what we're talking about. And remember this, whenever we're talking about this, you're talking about the compounded interest that was made on the other side, meaning the people who profited, and the compounding deficit that was taken from the people who were the victims of all this. And then it can't just be limited to slavery because, as you were just talking about, with the 40 acres and a mule and all these other deals that were, thrown back on, you got to go to Jim Crow. You got to go to housing discrimination. You got to go to the GI Bill. You got to go to Social Security. Like all these different things that comprise what it is, the wealth inequality in America. And I don't mean wealth inequality for people working in the same industry. I mean the descendants of the people who've been through all of this compared to everybody else who was able to what? Have a labor market where you weren't as competitive because you had a whole swath of the country not involved in that labor market in a free way. Like all of these things add up. And look, when we talk about these things, we forget, like if you were to run away in the 1800s, when you were caught, you know what they charged you with?
Stolen property, if I'm not mistaken.
Theft. That is correct.
Theft.
You're charged with theft, stealing yourself, your property. You stole yourself. Like that's how baked into the cake this was for government. So no, this is a government action, not a private action. And honestly, if you pull up Darity tonight, you'll get a lot of information about not only the debt and what should be paid, but who it should come from. And it's not taxpayers. Any huge bill, it's like, okay, if we do a new missile system next year, are you going to get a tax bill that says, hey, you're part of the missile system? Like, no, that's not how it works. Like, as of right now, Germany has paid, $88 billion to Israel in reparations for the Holocaust and everything else. They've also had personal lawsuits. With that, Israel was able to build their infrastructure, their water system, electric grid, hell, even their Navy. A lot of that money came from the reparations paid to them by Germany. So when you look at these reparation cases, it's not like the Dave Chappelle show where people get a check in the mail one day and they can just go out and just blow it if they choose to. Like, that's not really how it works.
I see your point, and you have me at a disadvantage because I've not read that book. But I do want to – I'd like you to elaborate on something. How is it that the government is going to pay that bill without footing it to the American citizen either in the form of taxes or in the form of depreciation of savings that comes from inflation? How does the government fit the bill without fitting it to the taxpayer?
Yeah. So first things first, we haven't seen inflation in a long time as far as proper inflation, like from the 40s, WW1 era or 70s era inflation, just because of global markets. Global markets have squeezed every nickel out of the supply chain to the point to where things are not only set as far as price, but interest rates are pretty much on the floor. So the idea that this all of a sudden would cause inflation, okay, I'll put it to you like this. In 2008, we had a world economic meltdown. Every central bank almost in the world started doing what? Shuffling paper into their economy to try to prop their economy up during the midst of that meltdown. Did we see inflation? Did we see the scary stuff from Zimbabwe or Venezuela or something like that? No, we didn't see any of that. Why? Because markets are now fit to handle things like this, a large influx of cash. And if you look at the DOD bill every year, like we're being honest, the expenditure to the military, if the inflation story was as people say it, we'd already be experiencing it every year. And, inflation, I think a lot of stuff with inflation is it becomes old wives' tales because the worst stories of inflation were by nations who did it on purpose. Germany, when they didn't want to pay France because France was squeezing the hell out of them, which led to the rise of Hitler, another thing a lot of people don't talk about. And Zimbabwe, when they didn't want to pay their bills to the Euro Bank, and Mugabe decided to tank his currency in order to not pay his creditors. Like it's a kind of a weapon. But as far as a country like naturally going through that process by spending, there's just no record of it now. The world is different, markets are different, and unless you're on like a gold unless you go back to backing your currency by gold, that's the only way you would be limited by that. Basically, every nation is based on what? Generational taxes, the idea that a nation is going to be here 100 years from now. So the nations who have good credit standing and young citizens, those nations what? Will be able to borrow, will be able to push bonds to the side, will be able to carry heavy amounts of debt without hurting themselves. Right now, what are we? 110% over-levered as far as debt-to-dollar ratio. You know, like there's no blood in the streets. There's no banks folding. You know what I'm saying? Huge.
So this is my response to you. So I'm Joe. I'm the other economic host. How you doing, Naz? It's good to have you back.
What's up? Same.
So first off, let's address your issue about saying that we never did see inflation. Last time I checked, when you did the global bailouts, that money was not handed out to checks to the American people in widespread. That money went right into the hands of the banks. And the banks turned right around and created debts and loans to Wall Street, which what did Wall Street do? They went and bid up the prices of financial assets. That's where the money went. So there was more money chasing less goods. They just weren't chasing the consumer goods. They were chasing the financial asset goods. And so therefore you had the Dow Jones Industrial Average multiply by 400% in 10 years. But you and I both know that our economy did not grow by 400% in 10 years. It only grew by, say, 25 to 50%. So, that's the reason why. In this scenario, what you're saying is proposing distributing that income to people who will spend it on consumer goods. And that's where the consumer price inflation will take effect, and it will cause those rising prices. Now, on to your issues about saying that we didn't see the inflations before remember, in times past.
I'm saying
go ahead.
Remember, I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm not saying not into consumer goods, but go ahead.
No, I'm saying that it will go into consumer goods. That because a lot of the let's be honest here, a lot of the people that will be receiving the reparations are of low socioeconomic status. They are trying to get by as it is. They don't have enough of incomes to properly save. And you're right. A lot of the money that they may get up front, they may save a good portion of that, but either way, they will spend a good portion of acquiring consumer goods that they could not afford before.
Yeah, that would actually be a good problem if they did that. But my point is you're going to spend more of that money on institutions, industry, and huge scale building. That's where the majority of money for reparation goes. You build institutions for the people who were harmed. And that's what you would see. That's what you saw in Israel, and that's what you would see here. And I would also make the argument that if they did get the money and start to spend, that would actually be good for us and expand our economy, because then we'd have consumer spending to the rate that we actually needed. Our biggest problem now is we have a really old population, and what do old people do? They save. Old people do not spend much, and that actually hurts your economy. It makes it stagnant and leads to deflation at times. So that's more of a bigger problem than anything else. The age of our population, the amount of baby boomers who, look, all of us on the phone, we probably spend a little more in a month than most baby boomers do, just in the sense of entertainment, fun, gas in your car, the things you do, rent, all the stuff you do, mortgage, whatever it is. But when you start talking about that baby boomer class, that is the group that actually hurts the bottom line, because by sitting on that money, they actually contract the economy. They take in but don't put out.
So that's completely incorrect. So what happens here is that you are correct on the first part. If the entire economy were driven by going to Walmart and say that people stop spending money at Walmart, you're right, Walmart would contract. So would other retail consumer goods. But when people spend money and they do not save, they take it away from the investment sectors of the economy that is not driven by demand. It is driven by interest rates. And interest rates are driven by the amount of saved money. The more amount of money that you save, the lower those interest rates become, which makes it cheaper to borrow money to invest in what are called capital goods production. So in basic sense, a farmer, if he does not save his money, then he cannot buy a tractor. And if he does not buy a tractor, well, yeah, he could go out there and work with his hands like the Amish do and produce a certain amount of crops. But you and I both know that if that farmer staved off some of his consumption, saved his money, bought a tractor, he'd be able to produce far more. So savings yields higher investment, and that higher investment increases the productive capacity to mass produce goods to meet the demands of the consumer. What we're having now is a situation where our central bank, our Federal Reserve, is flooding the markets with debt, artificially creating this idea that we have a lot of saved money, but people are not saving their money. They're spending their money. But the Federal Reserve is able to patch that economy together by filling it with debt. So the investors take borrowed money and invest it in the productive sectors of the economy. The consumers take borrowed money and spend it in the economy. But overall, what you get is more debt, and you don't get economic growth. So that's why in the last 40 years, this is no joke, our total debt to GDP has increased from 150% of our economy to 350 to 400% of our economy. If what you said was true, that consumption and increasing that consumption would spur that growth, that debt to GDP ratio should be about the same, but it's not. So we're not getting the bang for our buck as you're predicting.
Yeah, let me respond to that real quick. First thing, when you brought up the farmer situation, I think the thing that sticks out most, and this would go to consumers as well, how much are they saving? Now we're getting to how much profit are they taking home, and their inability to be able to do what you're saying, to just buy a tractor, live off the land, and create that, that productive farm that you're talking about. What is actually happening in most farming places we know, Big Agra walks in with a check and buys out these family farms who are no longer profitable because they don't have the capital or access to credit to be able to function in today's society as far as being a world business. So they have a problem. Now, to your second point where you said the debt has done nothing but grow, always remember that debt is what? Wall Street's assets, the 1%ers' assets. Whenever they keep talking about debt to us all the time on here, always remember that debt is their way of not paying taxes. So instead of paying taxes, they're able to what? Buy U.S. bonds, buy treasuries, make a return on them when they mature, and make a nice profit. So the idea of the U.S. debt being a nationwide problem, no, it's actually a private sector issue. It's not really a problem for them because they consider that really, really important. Matter of fact, we actually allocate how much other nations can buy from. So when you hear these people say, China's buying up all the debt in the U.S., they're going to call in the debt. No. China is only given a certain amount of debt that they can buy, a certain amount of treasury bonds, everything else that they can buy, and after that, they're cut off. But if they were to get rid of that before it matured, they'd bankrupt themselves because they want to make money too. And the U.S. is a really good investment as far as foreign countries looking at it for treasuries and bonds because they know what? The U.S., most powerful military state in the world, will be around for 50 years. Do you want to go buy bonds from Argentina? Do you want to buy bonds from Japan? Probably not. But U.S. bonds you want to buy. So that's one thing about debt that I think we get kind of confused about. We think debt is this huge thing that they're holding over our head generationally, and we have to pay it back decade by decade. No, these are these people's assets, and they love it.
So if you think that we don't have to pay back the debt, then we should just default on the debt. But you and I both know that if we defaulted on the debt, then every single investor would dump every single bond that they would. And what would happen is that they would change out the demand for financial assets for the demand for consumer goods. And that would drive the consumer goods prices through the roof as the financial goods prices would be totally obliterated, which is why we always have the promissory note to repay. But hold on, I gave you your point. So now let's go back to the farmer and the idea of why the farmer has to borrow money and why big agriculture is coming up and consuming the farm products. That's because the price of real estate is going up. And why is the price of real estate is going up? Is because we go back to the investment of the financial assets. So when investors take the money and bid up the prices, one of the things that they bid up the prices on, and of course you and I both know that goes to the wealthy, they bid up the prices of land. So what they're doing is taking that borrowed money And those prices of land are not contained in the consumer price index. But the farmers, the regular farmers on Main Street, they don't have the credit or the financial capability. But then that goes back to the federal government, who sat there and let the dog off the chain and gave the ultra-low interest rates to the big banks that then funneled that in. So what we need to do is go back to the horse's mouth and address that issue of why we're having artificially cheap debt until it be determined by free market interest rates. Because if we don't address that, the wealth and income inequality that has been exacerbated by our government policies in the central bank will ultimately continue. And what we will ultimately see is that we will see inflation in assets that are invested, but since they are invested assets, we don't count that as consumer price inflation. Then we say all that printed money didn't really damage the economy, but it did. It made the poor poorer and the rich richer.
Yeah, I would
buddy.
disagree with that point, but I definitely agree with your first point. And I would say this. Think about it in this way. How close are the majority of Americans to being debt peons? Basically, overwhelmed with student loan debt, credit crunched out with their credit cards.
Completely agree.
Their job, haven't seen a pay raise in a while. The idea of higher prices for things that you have to buy, the functionary things, gas, lights, water, actually gone up. I would say consumer goods are actually stable as far as prices. They're pretty cheap, or to the point of where we're always seeing them come down. But those things, I think that's what really gets everybody. The things that people actually always have to pay for, those are the bigger issues to me, and the things that need to be addressed. And as far as what you said about Wall Street, you are completely correct. It's essentially a Ponzi scheme. They take the money, they do stock buybacks, make themselves liquid, give it out to their shareholders, give them a good going away present. If they want to bring in a new person, then the new person comes in, the smartest man in the room, and says, you know what? If we fire 300 people, we'll be more profitable. Oh, good job. Okay, get that guy a raise. That was a really smart thing to do. Got rid of some more Americans. And just think about it. $10 million in a corporate boardroom. It's going to go to art, maybe some trips, but for the most part, it's going to go right back into their savings. But you spread that $10 million out amongst citizens. They're going to buy washing machines. They're going to buy cars. They're going to spend their money on, things that are actually going to what? Cause other people to have jobs, cause other people to go to work. The money will actually circulate. So we're on the same board on a lot of these things. We have different ways of getting about it. Look, I've read Locke. I respect everybody's intellectual ability. Anybody who's lasted that long had some very important things to say. And one of the things that really stands out with him is, you always got to remember, he hates the state. In his mind, the state is you can't live with it, can't live without it, so you have to deal with it. So what's the best way to deal with it? And I think a lot of his ideas have been perverted over the years by people who have no identity of working with the working class or treating the working class as if they are recognized as real citizens. And because of that, I think Locke's probably gotten a bad rep. I would say check out Mark Blythe. He writes about John Locke. Well, I like a lot of his stuff, but he gets into Locke a lot because he goes on programs that are on the left, and a lot of them try to hammer him on the Locke stuff, and he kind of just, like, yo, man, the beginning of this was bumpy. You're moving from mercantilism and feudalism to full capitalism. There were a lot of things that had to be figured out. When you go back to what it was before this, you know what I mean? It's almost like a child's play compared to what we have now. So we're in agreement on a lot of things, man. But I tell you, man, I am really, really, really aware of what debt can do, and also of what credit can do. And I just say this: at this point, citizens don't have sword or shield within the battle, and they're swinging both credit and debt, hitting you back and forth decade after decade.
But the idea that consumption can stimulate the economy is a misnomer. It can stimulate the retail consumption industries, but it will take jobs and production away from the capital industries by raising interest rates. All things else considered. The government recognizes this. This is why the Fed steps in and tries to print money to lower interest rates. But then that just leads to artificially increased financial assets and land and capital and property. then it has derivative effects. Because the prices of land, property, and capital start going up, many businesses realize these costs and say, oh, shit, I'm going to start taking hits in my profit margins. Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll go to China and India and outsource over there where the wages are cheaper, where the land is cheaper, and start buying up there and then ship the goods back to the U.S. So then since 1980, we started running chronic current account deficits. Before that, we were a net exporter of goods. Now we are a net importer of goods, meaning we consume more than we produce. And because of that, we are basically living off the world's wealth. The world is loaning to us and sending real goods and services to us. In China, the only reason why China wants this is because they operate by the same fictitious mentality. You see, when we print money and devalue our currency, we make the price of their exports more expensive in terms of U.S. dollars. That's not good for China who's so export dependent. So what they'll do is print their currency and then go buy ours with it. Then that's why they invest in government bonds. But that means that we have successfully exported our inflation to those countries. And despite those faulty statistics that the Chinese try to produce, which are government-produced statistic numbers, and I don't think it's accurate representations, they hide in there the damaging natures of inflation that goes over there. So we have, as a world reserve currency in the American dollar, one of the things that we have done is made sure that oil is priced in U.S. dollars. That means for every country that has to buy and import oil, they must first buy the American dollar. All of that is wealth transferred to us. And what I'm saying there is that if we can afford these reparations, I'm not going to say that the reparations will drive up prices. What I'm saying is that they would drive up prices if everything else was held constant. But because you have all these different moving levers, we may be able to have our cake and eat it too, but it just can't go on forever. One day we will print one too many dollars, one too many debt bonds, and the whole dominoes effect will come cascading down. That's all I'm saying, man, about that on the economic front.
That's right, but that's two separate conversations. That would be like saying we couldn't do the moon landing because it would have costed too much. Whatever you appropriate for some large-scale project, that's not going to affect your economy to that degree. Now, getting to China is an interesting thing because one thing we got to understand, too, is pricing as far as export and import. None of that is as important as supply chains and markets now because basically the third world got involved. So you could find labor on the floor as far as pricing, so everybody moved towards that. Now, we could say that they should have hired more Americans and we should have been more of a production country. That's a bad slip. But at the same time, if we're realistic about it, that's just a battle you're not going to win. So eventually you have to figure out how do you get in different markets. What is China doing right now? China's trying to move up the supply chain and stop producing cheap goods. They want to move into the sectors that we are most dominant in, which is the highly advanced stuff, the tech stuff, the software stuff, the hardware stuff, the stuff that really matters, the big stuff you can drop on your foot. They want to get out of the cheap nonsense realm. That's what the 2025 initiative is about. And that's kind of why you see them and Trump bumping heads because, of course, the U.S. is going to try to slow them down from doing that, as they should, as every other world power does when the next one is trying to come on. So no surprise there. But just think of markets in this way. When you buy a video game system, PlayStation or something, when you buy that system, Sony is what? Losing money on every system they sell. Why are they selling it to you at a loss? Because they want you to buy games. They've got the market of your living room when you put that system in there, and now they can sell you the software, meaning the video games, and at that point it becomes a profitable venture, and hopefully you keep this system for the life cycle and continue to buy games during that whole time. So price point, export, import didn't matter there. It was about what market. They want your living room. Same thing exists with supply chain. So China right now is feeding almost half the world. So despite their problems with slave labor, human rights, and all the other things that they're going to have problems with going forward, one thing they do have is an established foothold in places that we do not anymore. And look, man, this has been bad for labor. There's just no other way to say it. In Germany, they were able to de-skill engineering. Some of the people who used to work at Mercedes-Benz and create all these, incredible little machines and stuff, they were able to outsource some of that work to Romania and pay them half the cost. And at that point, anybody in Germany who raised the stink, they moved the factory to Romania in total. So you had to what? Labor kept having to go to the negotiating table and lose, give away. Well, we saw that same thing here. I'm a Midwest guy, so I've seen my share of strikes, layoffs, and everything else from a big company, working at a huge, worldwide factory. I've seen it happen, so I know how it goes. And, the same thing exists all over, man. So labor has to have a renaissance. Like, that's our biggest issue right now as Americans.
Well, Naz, we are at the hour and a half mark. We've enjoyed having you on, and Buddy Boy, if you want to call back on and continue these kinds of discussions, I love our friendly jousting and stuff, and seeing different perspectives. And certainly, my friend, we have enjoyed having you on. But other than that, we're going to have to wrap up this episode. So I'll give the last tidbit, then I'll let Joe finish up his segment, and then we'll get off. But Naz, thank you for calling in, and we hope to hear from you again. So going over from what Naz, no problem, man. So going over from what Naz is talking about, his arguments are basically twofold, and one's coming from John Maynard Keynes, and one's from basically his own personal philosophy, which is an interesting one. The formula from Keynes argues that higher investment precedes from higher consumption. So the more that we spend means the more that businesses invest. However, there's an interesting little chart that I have, and I'll share that with you guys on our Facebook page. So make sure you follow us at Antifederalist Radio, the Facebook page. Like and follow us to subscribe to all of our content that we update weekly. But there I have a chart. I'll produce a chart that shows that the higher amount of our net savings in our economy, the higher the amount of our net investment. And the correlation is absolutely shocking there. So that seems to kind of throw the monkey wrench into what our friend Naz was talking about, with saying that we need to spend more to invest more. Seems to be that on the statistical data, it seems to argue that the Austrian theory is correct, that the more that we save, the more that we invest. But then we've gotten off on this entire sidetrack on the economic damages of reparations. Let's spin back to my counterpart, Joe. Joe, before we had Naz talking about, let's wrap up what you were talking about with the political side of reparations.
Man, am I derailed. I'm actually really happy he called in when he did, because I prefaced my entire session with, I am not going to settle on we need to do it or we need to not do it. I was going to settle on it's really fucking complicated. My closing argument is that Asheville is most likely going to do this poorly. It introduces its own complications, because even if they did it successfully and then we did it at the state or national level, is Asheville still on the hook when they've already paid the bill? And the bottom line is, we have an identified party that needs reparations. We can't readily identify the party that is an heir to it. Naz made the point of that they're going after the government, which is how we got on this whole debate. It's a fucked up mess. It's really complicated. If we can figure out how to do it, do it. Yeah, it's messy. For any further questions, refer to Sherman and Martin Luther King, please. Thank you. Have a good night.
And when we're talking about Sherman, which Sherman is that?
William Tecumseh Sherman of the Union Army.
I thought you were talking about him.
The one who originally set out for the 40 acres and a mule and immediately got shut up by the next president.
Really? Now that's interesting on that. Well, guys, we hope that you have enjoyed our segment tonight and stuff. It's a very interesting one. Remember, next week, tune in. We will be doing another special. We are interviewing the vice presidential libertarian candidate nationwide. His name is Spike Cohen. Obviously, if you're a libertarian, you already know this. He's the vice presidential candidate for Joe Jorgensen, our presidential libertarian nominee. So tune in next week, Sunday night at 8 o'clock. That's July 26th at 8 o'clock. And, follow us on Facebook again. You can shoot us an email at antifederalistradio@gmail.com. You can follow us on Blog Talk Radio, Spotify, Twitch, or Stitcher, and Google Podcast, and, of course, YouTube. And so we'll be covering that next week. So we thank you once again. And this is Antifederalist Radio, and we're signing out.